Hello, I'm Nito Cobain. Welcome to Side by Side. My guest today grew up in Newark, New Jersey. She was raised by her grandparents. Her grandfather shined shoes for a living and told her when she was young, speak the King's English. She now is a Hall of Fame speaker. She has presented to audiences in more than 40 countries and has become one of the country's most influential experts on diversity and inclusion. Today, you and I get to meet Lenora Billings-Harris.
Funding for Side by Side with Nito Cobain is made possible by...
Here's to those that rise and shine, to friendly faces doing more than their part, and to those who still enjoy the little things. You make it feel like home. Ashley Home Store. This is home.
The Bud Group is a company of everyday leaders making a difference by providing facility solutions through customized janitorial, landscape, and maintenance services.
Coca-Cola Consolidated is honored to make and serve 300 brands and flavors locally. Thanks to our teammates. We are Coca-Cola Consolidated, your local bottler.
Lenora, welcome to Side by Side. I have known you for the better part of 3 decades. I have watched you as a major contributor to understanding about diversity in our country. I know that you have been selected and voted as one of the 100 global thought leaders on diversity and inclusion. You have been the president of the National Speakers Association with thousands of members. You've spoken in more than 40 countries. You've had a very splendid and colorful career. How do you define diversity?
You know, that's a question I get asked often, and it's amazing. People are confused about it. Diversity in and of itself simply means difference. And so really, as it relates to the work, it's diversity and inclusion. Becoming comfortable with people different than yourself and being able to include them in the decision making and talent and all of that type of thing. So it's about difference, and difference is not a bad thing.
No, differences, we should celebrate our differences and be appreciative for our similarities. That's what makes a community interesting and holistic. Whose responsibility is it to see that diversity happens? Is it a one-way street? Is it the leadership who should do that? Is it also the individual's responsibility to reach out and contribute in such a way that diversity and inclusion become a natural outcome of human relationships?
Right. I believe that it's everyone's responsibility, but as you know, if it's everybody's responsibility, then usually nothing happens. So it really needs to start at the top with leadership, whether it's the community or an organization. And the important thing is to connect diversity and inclusion to the organization's business goals or their service goals or whatever it is, so that people can understand why they're doing it. It's easy to say, yes, we should get along with people different than ourselves, but we have to first be intentional about it.
How does a business do that in relationship to their goals, their vision, their mission, and their values?
So, for example, with some of the clients with whom I work, the first thing we do is to look at what their business goals are for the next 3 to 5 years, and then we can step back and say, how will you achieve that with the talent you currently have? And very often, they don't realize that they're not looking at a broad enough market, whether it's market to bring people in the organization or broadening their footprint in their business. So when they start realizing what they're missing because they haven't tapped into underrepresented groups, then it becomes something that makes sense, that it makes sense to bring people on who have a different perspective, that might have a different view of things so that they can make better decisions. The second part of that is to be able to listen to those perspectives and not try to make everybody a cookie cutter.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions because I want to learn from you. You're an expert. You're very approachable. You explain things in ways we can all understand and hopefully apply. But there are some biases that we all have to deal with. Some known, some perhaps are subconscious. There is some resistance in societal circles about subjects like diversity, inclusion, so on. I don't know where they stem from. Perhaps you can tell me. Is it upbringing? Is it frame of reference? Is it religion? Is it political party? How do people become biased?
Well, it's a combination of all of those things, but what's exciting about the work right now is now we understand, because of the neuroscience that is available and as it relates to bias, is we understand how the physical brain operates as well as our mind. So we now know how biases form, and they form at a very early age. The moment you're born, quite frankly,
Really?
you start developing preferences. Not good or bad, they make sense at the time, but by the time we're an adult, oftentimes those biases that were framed for us a long time ago, we don't consider them when we're making decisions. That is, we don't look at another perspective. Now, every bias is not bad. That's so important to realize.
Every bias is not bad.
It is not bad.
What does that mean?
So, for example, you shared with the audience that my grandfather told me to speak correct English.
Yes.
Well, that developed a bias for me. I wanted to learn how to speak correctly without an accent. That was what he thought was most important.
Is that a
so
bias
that would be
or is
a
that
bias.
a skill?
Well, it's a bias when you stop having to think about it, when it just becomes a habit, when it becomes part of how you operate. In the beginning, though, when you're learning about your biases, most of which are unconscious, when you are willing to uncover them, and you usually have to have other people give you feedback, then it's not a habit yet to do something different. You have to intentionally behave differently, and then it can become a habit. Then it becomes just a normal way of business,
I see.
and that's how it affects the business culture.
And good habits are hard to develop, but they're easy to live with. And bad habits are easy to develop, but they're really hard to live with. Help me understand how I would identify my biases.
So what I always recommend is to find somebody you trust, usually not your life partner, because there's so much emotion attached to that. But find someone you trust, a good friend or somebody you work with on a regular basis, and say to them, I want to know more about, let's say, for example, since you're Caucasian and I'm Black, you might say, I want to know more about African Americans or people of color. And I really want to know if I happen to say or do something that might show my bias, just because I don't know better. So you have a conversation.
How does one show biases in actions, in language?
Yes, all of those things. So you're going to ask that person to point out to you, not in front of a lot of people, but point out to you when you might say or do something that happens to be biased. Now, what I have found with the executives I work with is they ask their whole team to do that with one another. So in the middle of a meeting, someone might say, well, you know, Dr. Cobain, I think there might be a different perspective on that. I think that might be just a bit biased. Are you open to hearing another perspective? So learning how to have a conversation without getting into an argument when you're talking about bias or talking about differences is a critical skill.
So Lenora, give me the categories of bias.
Oh my gosh, there are about 125, I believe, that have been uncovered so far.
125?
There's many.
So I think, when I think about biases, I think about race, religion, politics, sexual, anything to do with sexual orientation, maybe age. I'm not sure I could name more than maybe 8 or 10.
So those would be categories within which we could have biases. And then, so let's say, for example, with age, oftentimes people will say, oh, you know, that person's too old to be able to do this job. Baby boomers still don't know how to work a computer. They may say it with a smile on their face and even a joke. And even people in that category might say it. But what they're doing is perpetuating a negative bias. Because you and I both know that people in their 70s still do extraordinarily well with technology. So it's about disrupting those biases that come up in those categories. When it comes to religion, what I often say to people is, this is not at all about trying to change your beliefs. It is about helping you understand that all of us happen to be human beings and we're all connected. So how might we be able to work together? And then that develops into a longer conversation when the person might recognize or might identify what it is they have learned from their religion. And oftentimes we exaggerate. So people will say, oh, I can't even say Merry Christmas anymore. Well, that was never a rule. But if you don't know if the person's Christian, then maybe saying Happy Holidays would be more respectful. If you know they're Christian, say Merry Christmas.
So I want to just dig a little deeper in that. How does one practice inclusion without giving up a set of deep beliefs? You just mentioned Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. We all talk about that. So someone says, what if I say Happy Holidays? It's as if I do not recognize that I am a follower of Christ. So I want to understand, how does one do that without giving up principles, values, and tenets with which you grew up? Second, I want to ask you, is the word bias a negative word, or is it a neutral word?
So, first of all, I truly believe you have to be authentically who you are. You have to be integrous to your own beliefs and be respectful of other beliefs at the same time.
Yes.
So, as a leader, you can be respectful to your own belief while at the same time mentioning maybe other religions. When you're speaking, for example, is to not only say Jesus, but maybe make a reference, maybe say God instead, if you need to say it, or something from the Jewish religion, a quote from their beliefs, that type of thing, which says to the listeners, you're learned and you're learning, even though you're still being true to yourself. As it relates to bias, unfortunately, it has become a word that people think is negative, mainly because we only hear about the negative biases.
Yes.
But bias is a good thing. Our biases get us through life. Real quick example, my grandparents, when I was 5 or 6, taught me how to cross the street. Look left, look right, look left again. I don't have to think about that when I'm crossing the street, I just do it. And if it's safe, of course, cross the street. But when I'm in South Africa or London, if I followed that habit, which is a bias, I'd probably get run over because they drive on the other side of the street. So there are times where you need to be mindful that your habit, your bias, might not necessarily be appropriate in a given situation.
Tell me how a person can identify whether they're biased, and then how do they overcome that?
Yes, so first of all of us are biased. You can't not be biased if you're a human being.
But some biases, as you've just said, may be good. I'm talking about more injurious biases.
Yes, I think all of us do have some that are injurious and we may not know it. And that's why it's so important to get feedback. What I have seen happen over the last 4 or 5 years is that more executives are willing to be vulnerable enough to recognize that they don't know what they don't know. And so they are reaching out to people different from themselves and willing to say, you know, I just don't know. I don't know your life experience. I don't know what barriers might be getting in the way within our organization. And I need you to honestly tell me that. And more people are having the courage to speak their truth, and more executives are willing to listen, and that's when they recognize that the business or the organization does so much better when they have more diversity of thought, because that's ultimately what it's about within an organization.
So, Lenora, I've heard you say in the past that the best advice to give anybody is never compromise integrity. At all times, in all ways, make sure integrity rules the day, decision making, solution finding, etc. I want to put you on the spot. You talk about these executives who want to identify the biases, who encourage people around the table to call them out in a nice way. Do you believe that all this motion and commotion in America about diversity and inclusion is authentic? Or do you think sometimes people do that out of self-interest? You know, I've got to do that because if our company doesn't do that, we're going to get punished somehow by an institutional investor, or we're going to be written up somewhere. And if that is the case, does it in the end really achieve anything of value?
That begs the question to the leader, what are your organization's values? Because if your values are clear, you're going to know whether or not you need to speak up on
So
certain
give me an
issues.
example of values that would illustrate immediately that that organization chooses to be unbiased, chooses to be inclusive.
So the words, of course, are easy to write, but when an organization says their people are their biggest their greatest asset,
Yes.
then the question is, and how are you treating all of your people, not just some of your people? And there are instances where maybe it's not appropriate for you to make a public statement about something happening in the organization. You might make one that's an internal statement. Or what I have found is when you made no statement, no news is not good news these days. You need to make some type of statement, again, related to the company's values. Not saying because it's diversity, because it's inclusion, is what is the organization about? And that, as you know, when your values are clear, that helps you make all kind of decisions. And there are going to be some people who may not like your response, and you may lose some customers or clients. Is it worth it for to stay true to your values? And my experience has been, yes, you might lose some, but you gain many more.
Values drive the day. Otherwise, they're not values. Right? Values and principles, they're foundational. They must drive the day otherwise. In other words, if you love people, you got to be inclusive. Right? How can you say, my beliefs, my religion drives me to love my brothers and sisters? On the other hand, you don't treat them with respect and inclusivity and so on. There is a lot of talk in America today, and I know I'm talking to you about sensitive subjects here, but you answer the questions beautifully, and you illustrate in your answers a sense of inclusion yourself, that you are respectful of everyone, and you demonstrate what you talk about, Lenora, which is what I've always loved about you. So approachable, so disarming. You're not a fighter, you are an explainer and a persuader. So the word equity. The word equity conjures so many meanings for so many people. It is, for many, a word that is embedded in political angles, persuasions. You talk about diversity and inclusion. You don't always insert the word equity.
Sometimes, but actually of late I do, and particularly if an organization has already identified that that's one of the areas they want to look into. And that is the hardest, I must say.
Well, it's misunderstood.
Yes.
What is the definition of the word equity?
So people think equity means equal. It doesn't. Equal means that when you and I come into an organization, we're going to get exactly the same thing. However, you and I are different. You're a man, I'm a woman, we come from different backgrounds, etc. Now, we are fully qualified for the positions we're in. That's critical. But once we're in those positions, we may still need different things. So the equity means that maybe you already have mentors, that your supervisor is very comfortable with giving you feedback, whether it's positive or negative. As a black woman, particularly if my boss happens to be a white man, he might be uncomfortable giving me the feedback I need. He may be uncomfortable being a mentor simply because he hasn't dealt with black women before, and he somehow thinks we're extraordinarily different than everybody else. And so he's timid. He's afraid from equality. He's thinking of equal employment opportunity, and he'll get sued, so he ends up saying nothing. So that's where the equity imbalance comes in. The organization, if they're willing to do the work, might be able to uncover, for those underrepresented groups in particular, what might be some things that they need that other people are getting more easily. Not that they're they're unqualified, but they may not be getting it as easily. And in today's world, people are a bit more willing to speak up. But that equality thing, I'm so glad you asked the question, because people just get it so confused. Now, when we're talking about equality of justice or
different.
education,
Of course,
that's different. But equity is about...
And the law covers much of that.
Yes, yes. And so equity is about, are we giving people the tools they need to be effective at what they're doing? And are we willing to do the work to uncover where it is not equitable? That doesn't mean we're all the same. That means that you have to notice, our
So
differences.
you're describing the definition to suggest that we should be encouraging and resourcing and be aware, develop awareness about that. I must tell you that's not at all what I hear as a definition of equity. It is so embedded in political biases, since we've used that word, that people are scared that the form of government will change and the form of rule will change and so on. You're saying it's not that.
I'm saying it's not that, but I'm saying that I realize that it's hard work, because it's so much easier to just stay in your own bubble and continue to be around people who think just like you, because then you're less likely to have an argument. What I encourage people
Well, not
to
only
do,
that, but you're less likely to achieve more, be more, grow more, give more. You know, we used to say in the profiling days, when you do these personality profiles, make sure if you have a committee,
Yes.
have one of every
each one,
type. So that
exactly.
you can get real discourse and discussion that's meaningful.
and the key to that is that organizations have done a reasonably good job of hiring people of difference.
Yeah.
They've not done a very good job of being inclusive. That's why this work excites me now, because now that we know how biases work, they can discover why they were not as inclusive as they otherwise could be.
How is diversity different than inclusion?
So diversity is just bringing people around you
Different
who are
backgrounds,
different.
yes.
That's it. But that's not enough. Inclusion is not only having people around you who are different, but listening to their perspectives and their points of view.
Engaging them,
Engaging
involving them.
Now, the third part, though, is belonging, where belonging is when not only are you listening to somebody different than you, you respect them in the first place.
Even though they're different than you.
Yes.
Even though you may be biased towards that sector, that
Exactly.
category, learn more about it.
And you may not do whatever it is they're suggesting,
Yes.
but you're making an educated decision now
Yes.
instead of one just based on your past
Yes.
biases.
So, Lenora, the way you explain things is amazing. And I've heard you on the platform. You don't invite resistance. You really invite a desire to learn more. I can talk to you for hours because you're enlightened and informed, and you're clear in the way you explain things. As you see what is happening in America, what encourages you and what disappoints you?
What disappoints me is people of influence are not willing to explore different perspectives.
Why don't they?
Because we fear that which we do not know. And change doesn't happen until we get uncomfortable with the status quo. So if they're still comfortable with the way things have been in the past, why should they change? So people are afraid. That's discouraging, because I know from doing this work for so long, and so much research that's out there, that organizations, countries, communities do better when they're diverse and inclusive. It's proven. It's not just people making that up. So it's discouraging that people are not willing to lean into some of that discomfort so they can learn. What
And
encourages...
how do we get them to where you think they should be?
Yes. So what encourages me is there are more people today who feel more empowered than ever before to be their authentic self. So what I mean by that is people who have in the past kept their head down, done hard work, not rock the boat, even though they're miserable and not being heard, they're more empowered to speak up. They're more empowered to look different, to be different. Now, that makes people uncomfortable. However, what I believe within organizations is that those organizations that have begun a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative or journey
Where
won't be
does
let alone.
respect comes into all of this? Let me give you an example. If the values of a company and the personality of a company or an organization or a university, it doesn't matter, and then somebody wishes to be their authentic self, but their authentic self is very different than their organization. It looks like a rebel trying to change the values of the organization.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
So I used to speak to young people quite often. I mean, I still do occasionally, but I used to do a lot of it. And I would say to them, your objective is to get the job offer. Then your objective is to get hired. So it doesn't mean you have to give up who you are, but you need to study the organization first and be willing to come into the interview in a way that's not immediately going to disarm or in a negative way or make the other person
after
uncomfortable.
they're hired,
So
after they're
yes.
part of that society.
So what happens is after a person is hired and they have proven their worth, then they can begin to become more authentically who they are.
Right.
Now, as I say that, people are going to disagree.
But they shouldn't be very disruptive.
No.
If they know what the values are.
Yes, and therein lies the challenge, is some
a balance,
people
isn't
want
it?
to be aggressive and make people upset, and that changes some people.
It's all about a
It's a balance.
Lenora Billings-Harris, you have done so much to help us all, educate us all. I'm glad that you're with me side by side, and I wish you the very best in all your goings and all your comings.
Thank you so much for having me with you.
Funding for Side by Side with Nito Cobain is made possible by
Here's to those that rise and shine, to friendly faces doing more than their part, and to those who still enjoy the little things. You make it feel like home. Ashley Home Store. This is home.
The Bud Group is a company of everyday leaders making a difference by providing facility solutions through customized janitorial, landscape, and maintenance services.
Coca-Cola Consolidated is honored to make and serve 300 brands and flavors locally. Thanks to our teammates. We are Coca-Cola Consolidated, your local bottler.